Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest edition of the F.A.I.R Dialogue. It's been almost a month since we interacted with Zaina, who spoke to us about what feminism means to her and should mean to all of us, with, of course, a special focus on the faith that she believes in, her Islamic faith. Over these months, we've spoken with so many wonderful guests, including Juan Pablo Ramirez Miranda, Krishnendu Bose, Kamala Bhasin, Sonia Randhava, and Julia Rutledge. And each time, everything that they've said to us at the F.A.I.R project has led to weeks of thoughtfulness and learnings that continue to remain with us. In all our conversations, there have been a few things that have remained constant in some way or the other. One of those is a recognition that the understanding of gender remains one of our world's greatest challenges, and that for creating an equitable world, we need to first ensure that discrimination around gender is dealt with. Or rather, as what you've heard me say previously as well, we reach a situation where it does not need to be dealt with. Most of you have heard about the time when, as a childhood prank, I dressed up as a girl to such perfection that my own relatives believed that I was one. That prank gave me an opportunity, albeit for a very short time and at a very young age, to make a choice of whether I'd like to live my life as a man or a woman. And although I've chosen to continue living as a man, at the very least, and I agree, in a very simplistic manner, I was provided with a choice. Unfortunately, that is not a choice that too many people in our world get to make. Our guest today is a wonderful woman who continues to provide inspiration to millions of people all across the world that they too have a choice. But what I find most wonderful about Dr. Paula Stone Williams, Paula, is the fact that she does not claim to be perfect, to be all-knowing, or that she leads a perfect life. On the contrary, she has previously admitted to the confusion and difficulties that she has faced. Yet amidst all the confusion, she has a tremendously calming influence, which altogether, just on the surface, seems perhaps contradictory to being confused. However, as I have, and more recently, just a few minutes before we went live, and you will witness as well, that she does come, and when she does come and speak with us, that her entire personality and persona is so comforting just to listen to her, to absorb what she has to say, and consequently, or rather almost subconsciously, learn from her. Before I call Paula, and I will very shortly, because I know we're all waiting with bated breaths to hear what she has to say, I'd like to read out a few words that I came across as I was reading more about her. Words that, at least when I read them, I found them to be exceptionally powerful. And I know that they are extremely close to her heart as well. Paula, I'm sure that you know what's coming. They're not her words, but the words of a certain Mr. Mark Tidd. They read as, married, divorced, or single here, it's one family that mingles here. Conservative or liberal here, we've all got to give a little here. Big or small here, there's room for us all here. Doubt or believe here, we all can receive here. Gay or straight here, there's no hate here. Women or man here, everyone can here. Whatever your race here, for all of us, grace here. Now, whether you believe in God or not, I'm sure that all of us can agree to the power of these words. Welcome, Paula. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us today. We're extremely eager to hear all that you have to say. And I know there are many questions that our readers, our listeners have sent in earlier. But as of right now, I think we're just eager to hear what you have to say. Over to you, Paula.
Thank you so much. I love that you started with the ethos of our church. I'm a pastor of Left Hand Church here in Boulder County, Colorado, in the United States. We're a post-evangelical church, a rather progressive church, and we actually use those words every single time we meet, no matter what for, whether it's a Sunday service or any other meeting of the church. And we always use those words. They're very, very important to us. You know, you said that I'm a calming presence, even though I admit to my own confusion. But see, I think that's exactly the point. If you, in fact, admit to your own confusion and you acknowledge that confusion is, in fact, a normal part of existence, then you can, in fact, be able to be rather gracious through it all. and rather calming influence through it all, knowing that this too shall pass. I think the other thing that makes me calm at this age is the truth is I'm older than dirt. And so once you've been around for a few decades, you finally realize that a lot of things that really bothered you when you were young are not nearly as big as you thought they were. Now, the truth is, I was a successful, well educated, white American male. But the poet and mystic Thomas Merton said it's a difficult thing to climb to the top of the ladder of success, only to realize when you get there that your ladder has been leaning against the wrong wall. From the time I was 3 or 4 years of age, I knew I was transgender. In my naivete, I thought I got to choose. I thought something like a gender fairy would arrive and would say, okay, the time has come. What do you choose? And of course, I knew what it would be. It's what I was, a girl. But alas, no gender fairy arrives, so I just lived my life. I didn't hate being a boy. I just knew I wasn't one. I went to college, I got married, I had children, I built a career. But the call toward authenticity has all the subtlety of a smoke alarm. And eventually decisions have to be made. And so I came out as transgender and promptly lost every single one of my jobs. Now, in all 50 states of the United States, you cannot be fired for being transgender. So how could I be fired? Well, because in all 50, you can be fired if you are transgender and you work for a religious corporation. I was the CEO of a large religious nonprofit. I had been with the organization for 35 years. I'd helped them grow from a little tiny organization only serving New York City to a nationwide and then worldwide organization that developed religious communities of faith all over the world. We were one of the largest in the United States of what we did. I also was the host of a national television show. I was the editor at large of a national magazine. But all of those were within the Christian community. And therefore, they all were able to fire me when I transitioned. And though I had never had a bad review in any one of those jobs, I lost every single one of my jobs in just 7 days. How could that be? How could people that I had worked with for decades suddenly see me as someone who they needed to separate themselves from as quickly as they possibly could? Well, that's the first thing I want to talk about in our time together before I go ahead and talk a little bit about gender equity. Why does religion behave in the exclusive ways it behaves? I'm going to limit my thoughts to just the three Abrahamic desert religions: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. All three of those are religions of scarcity, which is understandable because they developed in the desert. There weren't many resources, and everyone thought, well, we have to take care of our own. And so they developed as religions of scarcity. And interestingly, in their more liberal forms, none of the three, Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, remain as religions of scarcity. Unfortunately, in their fundamentalist forms, all three continue to be religions of scarcity. They continue to see enemies where the enemies don't actually exist. And in the evangelical Christian world in the United States, a world that has much influence in our culture, they have created two chosen enemies. Those enemies are the LGBTQ population and people who are supportive of a woman's right to choose over her own body. How did that happen? Well, it's interesting that we are only one of 9 species that is a tribal species. The key social unit for the human species is not the nuclear family. We thought that for a long time. In the world of sociology and anthropology, we thought it even until a few decades ago. But we've come to understand primarily through the work of Edward O. Wilson, who taught at both Harvard and at MIT, that the key social unit for the human species is actually the tribe. It's the community. We are one of 9 tribal species. Like every other species, we have a selfish gene, if you will. But then these 9 species also have a tribal gene. They will, in fact, be willing to sacrifice themselves for the sake of the tribe. Now, in 8 of those 9 species, When an enemy comes into the camp, the species unites, the tribe defeats the enemy, some die within the tribe, but life goes on. Unfortunately, according to Wilson, the ninth species that is a tribal species, he calls them eusocial species, EUSOCIAL. He says, unfortunately, one of the 9 eusocial species has evolved in an interesting way. That this particular species believes that an enemy is necessary for the tribe to survive. So where no enemy exists, we create one. He says if we don't get a hold of that tendency, well, likely we lose the species and possibly the planet. And of course, you know which species he's referring to. It's us, humans. Somehow we have evolved to believe that an enemy is necessary for our tribe to survive. So where no enemy exists, we create one. Within the conservative Christian community, the fundamentalist evangelical Christian community in the United States, which is the major religious teaching in 28 of our 50 states, the 2 enemies they have created currently are the LGBTQ plus population, which includes me as a transgender woman, and a woman's right to choose. Interestingly, they've chosen 2 issues that cost their male leadership absolutely nothing. Only 3% of males are gay, and none of them would be having an abortion. So all of these conservative religious leaders have chosen 2 social issues that do not cost them anything to hold. On the other hand, if they chose the positions of gender inequity, or they chose the positions of a concern for socioeconomic equity or racial equity, well, then they would have to give up some of their privilege. But in choosing these 2 subjects, they don't have to give up any of their privilege. And unfortunately, I am in one of those 2 groups. And so that makes it very difficult if you happen to be a transgender person, and causes me to lose every single one of my jobs. Interestingly, as a species, we operate from 3 different moral standards. If you look across the world at every different country, every language, every ethnicity, every people group, you will find that all of us operate from one of 3 different moral standards. In the secular United States, particularly strong in the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States, and pretty much all of Western Europe, the major moral standard is the rights of the individual. That there is no greater moral good than to look out for the best interest of the individual and to protect the rights of the individual. This would, in fact, be the major moral standard of most secular people in the United States, of most people who are on the more liberal side of those 3 desert religions, of most of the people who do not claim a particular religion in the United States. Their main moral standard is the rights of the individual. No greater moral good than to protect the rights of the individual. It's unquestionably the moral standard in Western Europe. But there are 2 other moral standards of our species. The second moral standard is the integrity of the tribe, that there's no greater moral good than to protect the integrity of the tribe. Protecting the integrity of the tribe is more important than the rights of the individual. This would, in fact, be one of the perspectives of the fundamentalist forms of the 3 desert religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. They would have the perspective that there's no greater moral good than protecting the integrity of their religious community. It's also true with other tribal groups. There's no greater moral good than protecting the integrity of our national group, or of our particular ethnic group, or our particular language group. All of those would be in some way or another tribal groups. The third moral standard, after the rights of the individual and the integrity of the tribe, are the demands of the gods, that there's no greater moral good than to obey the demands of the gods, which is also a moral standard of all 3 of the desert religions in their fundamentalist forms, that the rights of the individual are subservient to the demands of the gods, and even that the integrity of the tribe is subservient to the demands of the gods. So it's difficult for secular people in the United States to understand why more conservative people will reject the LGBTQ plus community. On the other hand, those whose moral standard is the integrity of the tribe, and they are a part of a more conservative tribe, or whose moral standard is obeying the teachings of the gods, and their particular gods are very conservative gods, then we understand why they have chosen to reject our population. So within 7 short days, I lost every single one of my jobs. It's not easy being a transgender woman. People will often ask me, do you feel 100% like a woman? And I always answer, well, if you've talked to one transgender person, you've talked to exactly one transgender person. I'm not going to try to speak for anyone else. I feel 100% like a transgender woman. There are things a cisgender woman knows that I will never know. That said, over the last 7 years, I've learned a lot about what it means to be a female, and I've learned a lot about my former gender. And I'm here to tell you the differences are massive. There is no way a male can understand how much the culture is tilted in his favor. There's no way he can understand that because it's all he's ever known and all he ever will know. Conversely, there's no way for a female to understand the full import of that because being a female is all she's ever known and all she ever will be. But the truth is that life in virtually every country, every nation, every culture, every language, every ethnicity group is patriarchal in its origins and is much easier for men than it is for women. I discovered that immediately after transitioning from male to female. I've flown a lot of miles over the years, over 2.5 million actual miles with American Airlines. And so the very first time I ever flew as a female, I was flying from Denver to Charlotte, North Carolina, here in the United States. I got on a plane and there was some stuff in my seat that was not my stuff. So I picked it up, put my stuff down. I was holding the other things. There were some papers, newspapers, and a magazine or two. And a gentleman who was putting his bags in the overhead said, "That's my stuff." I said, "Okay, but it's actually in my seat. So I'll be happy to hold it for you, however, until you find your seat." And he looked at me and sternly said, "Lady, that is my seat." I said, "Oh, actually, it's not. It's my seat. It's 1D. But I'll be happy to hold your stuff for you until you find your seat." And then one more time, he said, "Lady, I don't know what I have to tell you. That is my seat." I said, "Well, actually, it's not. It's my seat, 1D. I virtually always sit in 1D. At that point, a man behind me said, "Lady, would you take your argument elsewhere so I can get on the plane?" I was utterly stunned. I'd never been treated like that before, the way I was treated by both of those men. In fact, I can tell you exactly what would have happened. I would have said, "Excuse me, but this, I believe, is my seat." And immediately, the man would have looked at his boarding pass, immediately seen that he'd put his stuff in the wrong seat, and would have said, "Oh, I'm sorry." I know that because over the decades, it happened dozens and dozens of times, but not this time. The assumption was that because I was a woman, I had no idea what I was talking about. The flight attendant finally took our boarding passes. She said to the gentleman, "Sir, you're in 1C, first row aisle." She's in 1D, first row aisle on the other side. Of course, unfortunately, seated next to me was the gentleman who had been behind me, asking me to get out of the way so he could get to his seat. I have a number of friends who work for American Airlines. One of them came on the plane to give the paperwork to the captain and waved goodbye as she left. When I got to Charlotte, she called me. She said, "Paula, what happened? You were as white as a sheet." I told her and she said, yeah, you've never been treated like that before, have you? You've always been treated with deference. Well, welcome to the world of women. Now, the truth is, I will not live long enough to lose my male privilege. I had decades of it before I transitioned, and I brought a lot of that privilege with me into my new gender. But it does not mean that I don't constantly see my power diminishing. So, not long ago, I was flying from Tucson, Arizona to Phoenix, Arizona. It's a short trip. It's usually flown in a CRJ 700, which is a jet that is fairly comfortable. This particular day, they had downsized the trip to a CRJ 200, which, in my opinion, is actually a clown car masquerading as an airliner. They just jam people into that thing. So I was called up to the desk, and the gate agent said to me, "I've moved you to the exit rows so you can have a little more room." And I said to him, "Well, thank you so much, but on a CRJ 200, the exit row actually has no more room than the other rows. The two best seats, such as they are, on that plane are 1A or 1F. I prefer one of those seats." He said, "Well, I can put you in 1A or 1F, but ma'am, the exit row has far, far more room. Are you sure you don't want to sit there?" I didn't argue with him because I've discovered arguing with people just doesn't get me very far. But I can tell you what would have happened if I was still a man. As soon as I would have said that, the gate agent would have said, "Oh, I had no idea. No one's ever told me that before about a CRJ 200. You know, you frequent flyers know all the tricks." Well, because it's true. We frequent flyers do know all the tricks. But because I was a woman, the assumption was that surely I could not have that much knowledge about the interior of an airplane. That is the common way in which I am treated now that I've become a female. I've noticed there are several things common if you are a female that were not at all true if you were a male. The first thing is, when I was a man, it was accepted that I was a bit of a Renaissance person, that I was someone with multiple abilities in multiple areas. I was, in fact, an ordained minister within the Christian church. I was also a pastoral counselor. I have a doctorate in pastoral counseling. I was also an adoption caseworker. I did a lot of work with international adoption. I also was the president of a corporation that operated homes for people with developmental disabilities. I was also the editor at large of a magazine. I was a writer. I was also a television host and a television writer. The assumption was that men are allowed to do lots of things. As a woman, I noticed that people really only think that I am capable in one narrow area, the area that causes them to know me. So, for instance, I was brought onto the board of a corporation. I was brought onto the board because the board wanted to understand why conservative religion behaves as it does in the United States. Well, I used to teach a doctoral course, Current Trends in American Religion. Several members on the board knew I had taught such a course, and so they invited me onto their board as an expert on American religion. So we had an opportunity where we had a new CEO who we wanted to have introduced to the public, and we operated a large national conference. They were saying, "Why don't we have her speak for the conference?" And I said, she's not a public speaker. I think probably it would be better if we interviewed her. I would be happy to interview her. But if you do want her to give a keynote speech, I'd be happy to do that as well. I would be happy to coach her in that process." At which point, a powerful white American male in the room said, "Well, if we're going to do that, why don't we hire a real coach?" Now, the truth is, I've done 3 TED Talks. I have been a speaker's ambassador for TED, working with other TED speakers. I have been a coach for TEDx. I've taught speech at 3 universities, 2 in the United States, 1 in Europe. What part of that makes me not a real coach? But what that man was doing is what I discover happens all the time to me as a female. In his mind, my only area of expertise was my knowledge about American religion. He couldn't think that I also would be an accomplished speaker who in fact taught speech at several different levels. It also didn't occur to him that I might be an adequate psychotherapist with full training in that area, because the assumption was men might have multiple areas of capability, but women do not. Did I speak up for myself? No, I did not, because that's another thing I've discovered as a female. You're on a knife edge. If you speak up for yourself, well, now you're too strong. And both women and men are threatened by you because you're too strong. On the other hand, if you don't speak up for yourself, well, now you're seen as not a leader. So you're really between a rock and a hard place. It doesn't much matter what you do, you're going to either be seen as that woman who's too strong or as that woman who's just not strong enough to be a leader. It's probably one of the reasons that in the United States, only 5.8% of Fortune 500 CEOs are female, 6.6% of Silicon Valley CEOs. 3% of venture capital in the United States goes to female-owned firms. 47% of first-year law associates are female, but only 15% make partner. Women don't have the opportunities in the United States that they should have, nor are they paid what they should be. In the United States, the average white female earns 79 cents on the dollar of what the average male earns. The average black female earns 64 cents on the dollar. The Native American females earn 59 cents on the dollar. Hispanic American females earn 54 cents on the dollar. At the rate we're going in the United States, it will be 100 years before we have pay equity, let alone any other kind of gender equity. I find it difficult to function in the world as a woman in ways I never found it difficult as a man. As a man, I took my privilege for granted. I did not realize that as a man, I got a head start in life. As a white man, I got a really big head start in life. As a white American who was well educated, I got a giant head start in life. I began my professional life closer to the finish line than most women ever even end their professional lives. There is a privilege that comes to white males in the United States, and frankly in Western Europe, and really in much of the world, that simply does not exist for women. It's been difficult to make my way. I've had to work twice as hard to be able to get the kind of work I did before, and then I'm not paid for it in the same way that I was before. Also in the United States, there's a lot of prejudice against transgender people. We only make up 0.58% of the American population, so roughly 1 out of every 200 people is transgender. And unfortunately, since those conservative religious groups hold so much power in much of the middle part of the United States, transgender people are generally not well respected. I've discovered there really are only 2 ways to get people to see me in a different light. I really think there are only 2 ways in which we get people to change their minds about much of anything, about any of us. You know, we humans, particularly those who were educated in a Western world, tend to think of ourselves as rational beings who make rational decisions based on data. Yet study after study after study shows we are not rational beings. We are primarily intuitive beings who make decisions not based on data, but based on the environment in which we were raised. Then the positions we take, we search for data that will back up those positions. So you can argue all day long about what it means to be transgender, about the legitimacy of the diagnosis, and those who've decided it's not legitimate will not listen to you because they're not making their decisions based on data. They're making their decisions based on emotion, based on the environment in which they were raised. So does this mean people don't ever change their minds? No. People do change their minds, but none of us will change our minds unless information comes to us in a non-threatening way. So then how do we get people to be open to those of other races or ethnicities or those who are LGBTQ? I think there are 2 things that have changed the playing field in the United States, that have also changed it in Western Europe and will be changing it throughout the rest of the world. One is proximity. The closer I can get to you, to any other person, the more that person begins to see, oh, I'm relatively a normal human being, roughly as normal or abnormal as that other person is. It's difficult for them to then classify me as something that is other when they're standing right in front of me and speaking to me, when they're in the same room with me, when they are in close proximity. So I think the one thing that will cause us to change our minds about other people is when we can get in close proximity to them. That's difficult to do in the days of the pandemic, and yet it still is difficult to do even outside of the pandemic, because even though we now can connect worldwide electronically, it's not the same as a personal connection of being in the room. The second thing that actually causes people to accept new information is narrative, story. We are, in fact, a story-based species. If you think about it, we don't sleep unless we're dreaming. And we don't dream in mathematical equations. We dream in stories. So the need for story is actually biological. We won't dream or won't sleep unless we dream, and we won't dream except in stories. I've discovered if I can be one-on-one with you, and I can tell you my story, and you can tell me yours, it makes it much easier for us to learn to get along with each other. For instance, a part of my story is the fact that I'm a member of a transgender family. My wife and I had 2 children, biologically ours, and 1 child we adopted from Kolkata, West Bengal. Now my son married a girl from Chennai, from Kerala. And so 3 of my 5 grandchildren are Indian, which causes me to have a little bit better, not great, not wonderful, but maybe a little bit better of the nation of India and the various cultures that live there than I might have if I had never had that kind of exposure. By knowing that little bit about me, it tells you a little more about me than just the fact that I'm a transgender woman from the United States. Now, maybe I have a bit of a connection with you. I believe that's what heals the nations, is when we can tell each other our stories and when we can find ourselves in close proximity to one another. I have a wonderful life. Because of my 3 TED Talks that have had over 5 million views, I now have a movie being made in Hollywood about my life. I'm writing a memoir for Simon & Schuster that will be out next year. My life has turned out far better than I ever imagined. And now I want to do what I can to make this world better for those who do not have the same kind of privilege and opportunities that I have. This is a difficult existence. Life is hard for all of us. But if we will work together with tolerance and understanding, I think we can create a much more fair world. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Paula. And I think I just have to start by saying thank you so much for all that you do, because everything that you're doing, the conversations that you have with people, the stories that you tell, as you very rightly said, they're all towards making sure that we actually reach an equitable world, which is honestly at times, Paula, it seems so difficult across everything, not just gender, but religion, societal norms, everything that you look at all around us. It seems so difficult, but then there are people like you who are helping us make it a little easier for us as well when we are looking at all of this. So thank you so much. I do want to start with a few questions, and I'm seeing quite a few of them coming into the comments space. And the first one I want to start with is because we've spoken about the difficulties of transitioning to being a woman and so on and so forth. I actually want to flip that, and Crystal's actually asked this question on chat, asking that what is something that you absolutely love about being a woman and the wonderful things associated with that? So just to flip from the difficulties
first of
to the
all,
wonderful.
one of the things we know that is likely true about being transgender is it's something that happens prenatally, most likely in the 2nd trimester. It's interesting that we know that every single human develops as a female, and then at the end of the first trimester, an androgen wash takes place with half of us, and that androgen wash causes half of us to become male, and the other half don't get the androgen wash and remain female. But interestingly, our brain does not make its connection to the body that's been created until early in the third trimester. And so the assumption is that something happens in the second trimester that causes the brain of a transgender person to not make a connection to the body that's been developed. So the thing that is the most exciting about being a female is finally your brain is able to say, okay, this is the body you should have. There actually is a very rare condition that has nothing to do with gender. There's a rare condition in which the brain never makes a connection to a limb of the body. It's virtually always an arm or a leg. The brain sees it as a foreign object. And so one of the things they've discovered is that the person is always in great psychological distress throughout their life by having this one appendage that their brain keeps saying shouldn't be there. Imagine how you would feel if you had a log sticking out of your eye. If you had a log sticking out of your eye, your brain would constantly be saying, hey, there's a log in your eye, and it would be psychologically distressing. Well, what they've discovered is if they remove the leg or the arm of that person loses all of the psychological distress. It's as if the brain says, thank you very much. I told you all along that was not supposed to be there. Now, of course, that's exactly the opposite of what happens with you or me. If we lose a limb, we actually have a brain that says the limb is still there. In fact, we can have phantom pain thinking that limb is still there. So when people have this very rare condition, they understand that it's because their brain never made a connection to that part of the body, to that arm or that leg. The assumption is the same thing is true with those of us who are transgender, so that our brain finds the anatomy of the gender that we appear to be and that we are on our birth certificate to be something that's very foreign. So the most wonderful thing that happens when you transition is finally your body is aligned with what your brain has been saying it should have been all along. But beyond that, on a much more practical scale, I would say the thing I appreciate the most actually is paradoxical and has a shadow side. I love friendships with women, and I love the camaraderie women have, that women tend to work collaboratively better than men do, which is interesting because the shadow side of that is the thing I dislike the most about being a woman, and that is that women tend to be very competitive with one another. They do not empower each other in the way that men empower each other. I think that men come into a room and the first thing they do is identify who the alpha personality is in the room. They rank themselves according to the alpha, and then they set about accomplishing the purposes of the alpha. So men will establish a vertical hierarchical understanding quickly when they come into a position, and then they'll set about to accomplish the task in a way that supports the person who is in charge. Still, men will empower one another in that process. They will encourage one another and work their way up that hierarchical leadership structure. Women don't do that. Women do not empower one another. Women much too often see each other as competition. Now, I understand part of that is because there are far fewer leadership positions available to women. But it's been ironically interesting to me that on one hand, I love working with women. On the other hand, I've had more conflict working with women as a woman than I ever had working with women as a man, because I'm seen as more competition as a woman than I ever was as a man. It's a rather fascinating conundrum, really.
No, quite interesting, quite interesting. No, but so what you've also done, Paula, is that because you had decades of living as a man, right, where you've yourself admitted to the fact that there were all these privileges that you didn't necessarily see. Along with that, there's also a performance that you were doing, performing as a man in that sense, right? In terms of all the things that you were doing as what a man would, right? Irrespective of what your brain is telling you. Then when you transitioned, and perhaps this is coming from a place of ignorance, but I do want to try and understand this, how difficult actually was it for you to, on the days after your transition, saying that, I transitioned, I don't need to play that part anymore. The part that I was performing all these years, it's when you wake up in the morning that there would just be that perhaps that thought that, am I still in that part, or now am I actually what my brain is telling me to be? Did you have those kind of thoughts in your mind
No,
at all?
it's actually a very good question. In my case, my transformation, if you will, from male to female was rather instant. I think everyone was surprised by that because as a male, I was a rather typical alpha male. There was no part of me that appeared to be effeminate in my behaviors at all. And so there was instant change. I mean, overnight change in the way I stood, in the way I walked, in the way I gestured, in the way I spoke. And that was disconcerting. I remember saying to my son, I'm the same person I always was. And he said, no, you are fundamentally different. And he didn't just mean in personality, he also meant in the way, not just the way I appear, but also in the way that I behaved, in the way I carried myself in the world. So for me, it was a very easy transition. One of the biggest problems, I don't know what it's like in other nations, but in the United States, one of the biggest problems for transgender women particularly is when they are seen as being transgender in the population at large. They don't pass in their new gender. So people look at them and don't think, oh, there's a tall woman. They instead look at them and think, oh, there's a transgender woman. Those people have a far, far, far more difficult time than I do. Generally, people do not see me as a transgender woman. They just see me as a woman. I happen to be very tall, so they see me as a tall woman, but that's about it. So it's actually much easier for me in that way than it is for a lot of other transgender women. But I think always, and I know, again, I'm only speaking for myself, but I would say that I feel like I live in the liminal space between genders psychologically. I live in the borderlands between genders. They've done fMRI studies, functioning MRI studies of the brains of transgender people before hormonal treatment and before transitioning. And they've discovered that our brains tend to function about halfway between male and female, which means that my brain never functioned fully male, but my brain also will never function fully female. So in that way, I say that I live in that liminal space. I still tend to think in some ways that I think are linear. I don't think in life as a 28-day cycles as a female does, because I don't see the life that way. I see life more linear. And so I think there are a lot of ways in which I'm kind of in that in-between world. The biggest difference I see is that I was very definitely an alpha male, and I am very definitely an alpha female. Alpha males are well received in the United States. Alpha females, not so much. We tend to be a bit of a threat to a lot of men and a threat to other women. And so that's probably the biggest area with which I struggle.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And what makes most sense to me is when you spoke about being in the middle of genders, not middle, but effectively having a bit of both genders in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
In which I'll have a couple of questions from chat right now. One that Shivani's asked and one that Angad's asked, where Angad effectively says that do you really think that gender or sexual identity should be the key defining aspect of an individual? And Shivani effectively then takes it forward to actually what the question that was running in my head when you said that as well, is that given the fact that gender stereotypes actually box men, women, and other genders into categories, right? Do you think that individuals identifying with genders are also perpetuating the stereotyping? Because as you said, there is a little bit of both genders perhaps in you as well, and as perhaps I would assume in every individual. I can say it for myself, I can say it for a lot of those others around us. So just by virtue of that being really the defining part of our identity, saying that, when you're filling up a form, when you're getting born, at any stage, are you male, are you female? And frankly, you don't even have space for other genders. That's a separate battle altogether all across the world. But even if you did, it is still another category, but it's still categorization at the end of the day. Do you really see then when we have conversations around gender and so on and so forth, are we also in a way perhaps creating that distinguishment, that categorization, and is it actually good, bad, or necessary perhaps at this point in time?
It's a very good question, and there are two very different schools of thought. I'm not as acquainted with them in other countries as I am in the United States. In the United States, there would be an entire school of thought, anthropologically, sociologically, psychologically, that gender is a pure social construct, that we actually arrive as a blank slate, and our identity is determined by the environment, how we are treated by the world in which we are raised. I actually do not subscribe to that view. I believe that we do have a predisposition before experience to certain types of behavior and to a certain gender presentation, a predisposition before experience. Now, I would acknowledge that gender is, in fact, a spectrum, and it goes from very, very masculine to very, very feminine. And we all know more feminine males and more masculine females. But I do believe that gender is a legitimate reality, and I do believe it is not just biologically determined by one's anatomy, and of course there are a plethora of different intersex conditions as well. So even there, even biologically, you have people all across the spectrum with everything from androgen sensitivity disorder to Klinefelter syndrome, where they actually do not have very clear genitalia or a very clear body that is either male or female. So I do understand there are exceptions, but on the whole, I believe that gender is in fact something that's here to stay with the species. And I believe that the majority of people are always going to identify as one gender or the other. The majority of transgender people will prefer using the pronouns of the gender with which they identify. So I always use the pronoun she, her, or hers. Transgender man will use the pronoun he, him, and his. It is true that we have a lot of gender non-binary people in the world as well, but a major study was done of 27,000 people who identified as either transgender or gender non-binary in the United States in 2017. That study found that 62% of those who identify as gender non-binary are between 18 and 26 years of age. And that tells us something. We're not sure exactly what it means, but it, I believe, means that we need to wait a little while longer before we see if, in fact, we're going to have a lot of people who prefer a non-binary presentation of gender. My particular church, Left-Hand Church in Boulder County, Colorado, we have a fair number of members who are gender non-binary. Their preferred pronouns are they and theirs. And that's fine, wonderful. I'm very pleased to have those people in my church and to be interacting with those people on a regular basis. But where we are 100 years from now on that issue, it'll be interesting to see. Those who want to say gender is purely social construct, my pretty firm opinion on that one is that that will be proven not to be true. That we'll discover that the vast majority of people have a predisposition before experience to certain types of gender-specific behaviors. But that does not mean that there are not plenty of exceptions to that. And I like the fact that we're making room, certainly in American society, and I hope in pretty much every place where the main moral standard is the rights of the individual, that we would be moving in that direction.
Thanks, Paula. So one of the things that usually comes up when we speak about transitioning men or women, and you know, the whole concept of fluid genders and gender fluidity in that sense. What some people say, and I'm not talking about religious or legal positions or so on and so forth, but just in terms of very practical positions about a man who, for that particular point, who is from true gender fluidity, and I'm using the word claims, and you'll understand why I'm saying it, claims to be a woman at that point in time and entering women restrooms, right? Or vice versa, right? At the end of the day, how do you not feel that at some point, perhaps, that the rights of transgenders and the rights of women, and specifically women, may at the end of the day start clashing at some point of time, especially because of the way that society is constructed, everything around us right now, right? And especially when we're looking at, again, especially like restrooms is just an example in my head, right? There could be other examples as well, but that's just the very first example that comes in, because as a child, then you're always told that this is where you go, this is where the women go, and so on and so forth. And then there's a confusion around that if you are transgender in that sense. And but then how do you because gender fluidity, maybe perhaps later you aren't. I'm sorry, I'm sounding very confused right now, but you understand exactly why I am, right? And then and then things that follow thereafter. And then really, and then the crux of the question is the rights of women for their privacy and so on and so forth, versus then the rights of transgenders, who then at that point or in their entire lives do see themselves as women, transgender men, of course.
I think there are actually two separate questions in that. There are two separate issues at play. I think, first of all, we need to understand that our tendency, as Edward O. Wilson has said, that unfortunately humans have evolved to believe that an enemy is necessary for the survival of the tribe. And so enemies are created always of things that we do not know much about, things that we fear. And so anytime there's a new reality that comes into our world, we will initially fear that reality. We will see that reality as a threat until it's been proven not to be a threat. And if in fact it threatens our power base in whatever that happens to be, well, then we will continue to see it as a threat. You see this in the United States. Very unfortunately, after 400 years of slavery, we still have systemic racism built in that comes from the white population creating enemies that don't exist in the Black population. And it's going to be a long time. We've really gone in the wrong direction in the last 4 years. And I think it's going to be a long time before we finally get there. So the reality is we do create enemies that don't exist. And often when I find people opposed to me using a women's restroom, for instance, or opposed to my right to being transgender, they will be working from a position of ignorance and fear. And like I said, as soon as you are able to get in close proximity to them and they can see you as a human and you are able to explain your story to them, once they no longer fear you, then they're fine. They have no difficulty whatsoever with who you are. They are willing to assimilate you and other transgender people into their world without any difficulty whatsoever. So I think that we have to fight for our rights, and we have to fight against the fear that is not based in any kind of reality. There is no way that we are a threat. For instance, in the United States, you see a strong narrative in the very conservative states that we are a threat to children, that we might sexually abuse children, and that the accusations come primarily from religious people, from conservative Christian people, as a matter of fact. Well, it's kind of interesting, over the last 20 years, how many transgender people have been accused of being in a restroom that does not agree with the gender on their birth certificate for nefarious purposes. So how many transgender women, for instance, have been in a women's bathroom for some type of nefarious purpose, and the assumption is that that we will be in that bathroom to prey on children sexually. No person has ever even been arrested for that, let alone convicted. Not one in the history of our nation. On the other hand, the three major insurance companies that insure the three largest, or the seven largest Protestant denominations in the United States. Nope, I believe it's all of the Protestant denominations. The three largest insurance companies that represent the largest Protestant denominations in the United States have paid out 7,000 claims in the last 20 years against Protestant clergy who have, in fact, sexually preyed on their parishioners, on members of their churches. So the group that is making the accusations and in calling us the predators are actually themselves 7,000 times over the predators compared to our population. So what's happened there, that's the exact reality of what I'm talking about, creating an enemy that does not exist. We're in the bathroom for the reason everyone else is in the bathroom, to use the restroom. And so those things are just pure fear-based. And we know the answer to that is proximity and narrative, is helping those people to hear our stories. Part of why I'm here tonight, coming to you pro bono. And it's also a part of why I'll tell my story anywhere, because that then dissipates the fear. That's the first issue. But there is a second issue. It's an issue that's often taken up by radical feminists here in the United States. And they say that transgender women particularly are just men trying to, in one more area of life, take over for women and control a woman's experience, which is, in its particularity, absurd and ridiculous. But in its genesis, I understand it. A lot of transgender women will claim that they live a 100% female experience. And I actually believe that is unfair. I don't see life in 28-day cycles because I never did and never will have a uterus or ovaries. Of course, there are a lot of cisgender women who do not have a uterus or ovaries either. But as an example, there are a lot of ways in which I brought my privilege with me when I transitioned. I brought decades of male entitlement with me. And I do believe it's important for transgender women to acknowledge that our experience is not the same as the experience of a cisgender woman. And I readily acknowledge that all the time. Unfortunately, some of the radical feminists still seem to want to take away my rights and want me to not exist. But the truth is, we're here, like I said, about 0.58% of the population. There's been a lot of backlash against J.K. Rowling, the writer of the Harry Potter series, because she has not taken a particularly positive view toward transgender women. But if you look carefully at what she's saying, she says that we do have a right to be transgender. It appears possibly that she might be saying you just don't have a right to call yourself a woman. Well, I would disagree with her on that one. I do believe I have a right to call myself a woman and to present as a woman. And in fact, I would say that I have. In fact, I knew I was transgender from the time I could first breathe. I mean, I knew that I should have been born a girl. And so I think that needs to be acknowledged. At the same time, I do understand that I do not have the same experience as a cisgender female. And I think a lot of the conversation will be a lot of the difficulties that exist might be ameliorated if, in fact, those of us who are trans would be willing to acknowledge that. And again, I'm only speaking for myself. I cannot speak for any other transgender woman.
No, no, absolutely. But what I really take from that is the fact that it's ignorance, really, to a large part, that's propagated across through various means, and different people are propagating that ignorance upon all of us to not really understand. Because what you said very, very clearly is, and if you're telling me that there's not even been a single case then, of there being an issue with the transgender entering a ladies' restroom. Where is this even coming from? It's clearly coming from the ignorance of knowing the facts, right?
Well, and one of the things, if I could interrupt you just for a second, one of the things I would say is that people confuse gender identity with sexual identity. Your gender identity is who you want to go to bed as. Your sexual identity is who you want to go to bed with. So your gender identity has nothing to do with your sexual identity. Some transgender women are attracted to women. Some transgender women are attracted to men. Same thing with transgender men. And so a lot of people just in ignorance will equate sexual identity with gender identity, and the two actually have nothing to do with each other.
Yeah, but more ignorance, right? There are more people who would always confuse the two and mix the two up. And then when you suddenly realize that you're not paying as much respect to the L and the G of LGBTQ either, right? And then when you're looking at trans people, then you recognize that they also have the rights that are with the L and the G and so on and so forth, right? But no, I think extremely intriguing. Let me just take it in a little bit of a different direction, because we are on the hour mark, and I don't want to keep you up too long. I know it's night for you, but you'll have to bear with us for a few more minutes right now, because I do have a
Sure.
couple of questions.
I'm good. I'm fine. You can keep going.
Oh, good. Thank you so much. So we've got Ayush on chat, who's actually asking you about your religion, right? Where his question really flows from the fact that what was the reaction of your religion to your transition? You alluded to it briefly about being fired really from the institute that you were working in and so on and so forth. But to the fact that today you still are a pastor, right? So clearly there is still that belief in your religion. How have the two really been able to marry your identity and your religion, in spite of perhaps how your religion would have reacted to you in the first place?
Sure. Um, I was resoundingly ostracized from the evangelical world, from the conservative Christian world. I was a part of a denomination of about 6 or 7 thousand churches. I was a national leader. Um, Most people would say I would say that. Um, and I was gone pretty instantly. I knew thousands and thousands of people. I've heard from post transition, I've heard from about 60 of those people in a nice way. I've heard from hundreds and hundreds in a not so nice way. I think last I thought about it, I had met about 20 of them face to face, 6 more than once. So pretty much that world completely ostracized me. But just sticking with the United States, and unfortunately, I apologize, but most of my statistical knowledge is based on the United States. 52% of the Christian population in the United States is supportive of the transgender population. Only 48% is not. It's just that right now in the US, that 48% is evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity. And that has more influence in the United States right now than mainline Protestantism. So if you take a look at the Roman Catholic population, for instance, about 70% of the US Catholic population is supportive of marriage equality, which is a law here in the US, and transgender people. But the leadership of the Catholic Church, of course, is not on either issue. You take a look at the Jewish population. The major Jewish denominations in the United States are 83% supportive of the transgender population. A lot of the mainline Protestant denominations in the United States, the Presbyterian Church of the USA, the United Church of Christ, the Disciples of Christ, the Episcopal Church of the US, all of those are in the neighborhood of 62 to 66% supportive of marriage equality. But evangelical Christianity is at 36% supportive of marriage equality. So we actually go back to what I had talked about at the beginning, and that is that all three desert religions, all three Abrahamic religions are desert religions. Christianity, Islam, and Judaism all had their beginnings in the desert. All began as religions of scarcity, which is understandable because they began in the desert where there are not many resources. And the unfortunate part is that while the more liberal expressions of all three of those religions are very supportive of the LGBTQ plus population, in their fundamentalist forms, all three are not. They still see religion as a religion of scarcity and would put us on the outside, not on the inside. And it's unfortunate, but it is in fact a reality. So when I went back into ministry, it was because I am in fact a Christian. I do in fact follow the teachings of Jesus. I would not be a theologically conservative Christian. I would be a more liberal Christian. We have a lot of people in our church who would not even consider themselves particularly to be Christian people. We would have people whose leaning is more toward Buddhism or toward any one of a number of other Eastern religions. We would even have people who consider themselves to be agnostic or atheists. I believe that what a religious community does is it gives us a chance to answer the basic questions of life. If you take a look at what caused us as a species to move beyond blood kin to a tribal level, which was critical for the development of our species, until we moved beyond blood kin to become a community-based species, we did not make much progress as a species. We started making huge progress forward in creating civilizations once we moved from being a primarily blood kin species to primarily being a tribal species. What caused us to do that? The assumption might be that it was the need for safety. The desire for safety brought us beyond the level of blood kin to working with other groups of people. The truth is that's not the case. What actually brought us together was the search for meaning, man's search for meaning. So think about Stonehenge in the British Isles, or many of the ancient, the pyramids of Egypt. Many of the ancient historical markers were of a people who came together searching for meaning. Why do we exist on this earth? Why do we die? Why do we long for something beyond life on this earth? That is what brought us together. And I believe that that's what a good spiritually based community does. It invites a group of people to come together and ask the question, what is the basic meaning of life? Why are we here? Why am I here? And to what end am I here? And for what purpose am I here? I actually tend to believe that the teaching of Jesus is very relevant today. I think the most important thing Jesus ever said was an answer to the final public question he was ever asked. He was asked which of the 613 laws of the Old Testament was the most important, of the Hebrew scriptures was the most important. And he said three: loving God, loving neighbor, and loving self. Now, I define that God as the God who burst on the scene 14 billion years ago in all of God's complexity, ever expansiveness, and mystery, a God who's rooted in relationship and founded in love. And so that, for me, is what drives me religiously, this desire to love that God that I just defined, and to love my neighbor, which is every human being with whom I come in contact, and to love myself. And if you can't love yourself, you can't do the other two. And so for me, to be a part of a more liberal expression of that Christian faith, where you're welcome to bring your other faith along with you as we ask our questions together, that is something I consider to be a privilege. And so I love being one of four co-pastors at my church. We have both a creek and a canyon in Boulder County that's called Left Hand. And it's very much a county-wide landmark. And so that's why we called ourselves Left Hand Church, in case anyone wonders. It's because it's a name that in Boulder County, Colorado, I would identify us as a county-wide church. And that's exactly what we want to be.
Yeah, so there's so many questions that are running in my head just right now about interpreting God and interpreting the words of God and so on and so forth, right? But I'll stay clear of those for the here and the now, and stick to the comments that are coming up on YouTube. And Ayush, who just asked this question about religion, he's got a follow-up question for you, which is on a little bit of a different tangent, where he asks, you mentioned a couple of times that you knew from the beginning that you would want to associate as a woman, right? But yet it took you as long as it did, because, and I can of course hazard a guess as to why it took you as long as it did to transition. But would you want to address that for Ayush?
Sure. Most of us who are transgender females, and that's not necessarily quite as true for transgender males, and I won't speak for transgender males. It's also interesting that not as much study has been done on transgender males. But for transgender females, most of us knew from a very, very early age that we were transgender. In fact, I have a neighbor who has a transgender daughter, and the first phrase of that daughter was, "Mommy, I a girl." And that would be rather typical of us. My own understanding of it, which is uniquely mine, is knowing from a very early age that I should have been born a girl. And thinking right up through about age 5 or thereabouts that I got to choose. And so since I got to choose, I would say to the gender fairy, is what I perceived her to be, Yes, I was actually born the wrong thing. Please turn me into a girl now because that's what I want to be. In fact, I think in some ways I may have even seen myself as genderless at that point and thought that a gender fairy would be able to somehow magically change all that. I actually realize now that was even male entitlement. That was a little white boy in America thinking that he got anything he wanted, including the opportunity to change genders. But it was, for me, something very much deep inside me, desire to that I should have been born a girl. Unfortunately, I was raised in a fundamentalist Christian family where even mentioning that was going to cause me great harm. And so I hid it. I hid it until I could hide it no longer. Unfortunately, 41% of people who are transgender attempt suicide at some point or another in their lives before transitioning. It is not an easy diagnosis to deal with. In the DSM-5, which is the American psychological book of psychological disorders, they call it gender dysphoria. They don't call it a disorder, but they call it a condition, gender dysphoria. And it is difficult because in much of the United States, it's still very much not accepted. And in my case, I really thought that getting married would cure me. It did not. But I also knew that transitioning at that point would make my life extremely difficult. Finding a job would be hard. It would be difficult for my wife and my 3 children. And so I fought it for as long as I possibly could. And finally came to the point that I could fight it no longer. And in my case, it came as almost a sense of a call. There was a particular night in which I had the strongest sense that it was my responsibility to transition. And even though I knew at that point I would lose all of my jobs, most of my income, that I really needed to do it to be true to myself.
No, and aren't we glad that you actually did? Because, as you said, it is a struggle. It comes from a lot of that you've been saying all throughout, frankly, in terms of as what I spoke of as ignorance, what you're speaking of as a knowledge, lack of understanding, the male privilege, all of these things. I think they all stem from a lack of conversation. At the end of the day, is what we're ready to.
I think you're exactly right. I think that again, proximity and narrative. If we are able to have a conversation with each other one-on-one, and we're able to tell our own story, each of us our own story, that we will in fact gain great understanding of one another.
Yeah, but Paula, and just on that, like, how do we actually manage to do this? Because it's something that we even at the F.A.I.R project, on a lot of issues, including gender, we keep wondering that, I can only speak to you if you're willing to listen to me, right? But people are not willing to listen. So the moment you tell them that this is what I want to talk to you about, that's exactly when they turn away and then they walk away, right? Or say that, okay, no, stop wasting my time. I'm here. Let me have a good time. Let me have fun. Let me do this. Let me do that. Oh, let's talk about X. Oh, don't you want to talk about the fact that there are farmers dying in our country? And of course, that's very important. It's extremely important to talk about that as well. But this is something that I have to say. At least hear me out here as well. Just that entire challenge. And again, just coming back to how I started this point, that for us to be able to speak with people, people need to be willing to listen. And unfortunately, people are not willing to listen. How do we try and bridge that gap, even if we're willing to have a conversation?
It's a terrible concern of mine, or it's a great concern of mine, and I believe that it's rather terrible how it's developed, particularly here in my nation in the last 4 years. We are more polarized than we've ever been before, and there is far less tolerance than there's ever been. And even within social media now, we find ourselves creating and then living purely within our own little tiny silo. And that is so destructive to our ability to get along. I mean, we all 7 billion of us are on a tiny planet that is in peril. And if we can't learn to get along, I think that Edward O. Wilson, the sociobiologist, is right when he says that unfortunately we've evolved to believe an enemy is necessary for our tribe to survive, and where no enemy exists, we create one. He says we don't get a hold of that, we lose the species, and I'm pretty convinced it's true. I don't know how to do it. other than one person at a time, one opportunity at a time. It's why, I'm willing to be here, at 11:15 at night in Colorado in the United States, talking to you in the middle of the day, because I believe that this kind of conversation is what's absolutely necessary. I sit with my 5 granddaughters who are all between 9 and 12 years of age, and 2 of them are white and 3 are Indian and Black. Um, and I look at how precious these girls are, and I'm terribly concerned that they're going to grow up in a world in which, in the United States, 3 of them are going to have a far different experience than the other 2, because they are brown women of color, and that is putting them at a disadvantage in our current environment, a disadvantage far worse than it was 5 years ago. So I hope that we're going to be heading in a direction of greater tolerance. I know we certainly see it in parts of the world, and we don't in other parts of the world. And I think that people like you and I have our work cut out for us as trying to be people who bridge that gap, plus all of the people that are watching this tonight.
Yeah, and that's really the thing. At least the silver lining is that, at least with all that you've said, you've got me now, who's heard what you have to say, and I will make sure that I try and spread the message more,
Yeah.
in terms of everything that you've said and you've educated me with today. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners also will hopefully then take that conversation forward with others as well. And that's the silver lining.
I think there's one other thing I would say too in terms of resources. I've done 2 talks with TED, one that was recorded with TED International, that's New York City based. And TED does wonderful work in bringing us all together. When I attended the TED Summit in Edinburgh, Scotland last year, Americans were in the minority, and that's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I believe more ventures like that bring us together are really essential. And I would encourage all of your contacts and viewers to go to TED.com and watch some of the TED Talks, particularly the ones that are focused on what will bring us together as opposed to what tears us apart. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, absolutely. No, interestingly, I think that's where the entire idea of the FAIR project actually came to fruition as well, because I delivered a TEDx talk here in India about fairness. And surprisingly for me, I thought no one's going to watch it, but we had over 100,000 people watch that as well.
Oh, that's
And
wonderful.
and suddenly then you realize that, okay, what I have to say, it's clearly resonating with people. Even if it's 100,000,
Yeah.
it's still a lot of people who it's resonating
It's a
with.
lot. Yep.
And then thereafter, now we're a full-grown project. We talk about fairness, we talk about equity, and so on and so forth. Which brings me to my next question, and then we'll probably have a final question, and we'll let you go because it is quite late for you. But something that I noticed, in one of our listeners also noticed that you use the word equity a couple of times, right? Not equality. And equality is usually when we talk about gender equality is what usually people end up saying. But you use the word equity. Is there a particular reason for that, or is that just an alternate word that you use for equality?
No, they're 2 different things. Equality is under the law in the United States. Men and women, in most ways, have equal rights. So that is equality. Equity is that we don't start at the same place. We've started at very, very different places. So the opportunities for me as a white male to get to the top were far, far, far greater than for a white female to get to the top. And her ability to rise to the top is far greater than a male of color, whose ability to get to the top is far greater than a female of color. So equity is trying to bring us all to an equal place where we all have truly equal opportunity. Because we can have equality under the law, but that does not guarantee equity if, in fact, you have far fewer financial resources, far fewer social resources, far fewer resources of any kind than I might have. And until we are both starting at the same place, on the same starting line, equality is not nearly as important, in my opinion, as equity, as getting us to the same point where we each have equal opportunity, as opposed to just equality, but equal opportunity. That's equity.
Oh, fantastic. I think I'm glad I asked that question, because that's really the way that we look at things here as well, across everything that we're looking here in India, in all the conversations that we're having, is that don't just tell me that I have the rights, because if I am not able to do anything with those rights, then there are no rights at all, right?
Exactly. That is not true. That's not going to get us to equality, right?
Exactly. So finally, Paula, I have to ask you this on behalf of the entire FAIR project before we leave. What is your idea of fairness? When we talk about fairness and about being fair, of all that we've spoken of, and maybe perhaps outside of that as well, how do you see fairness either in your life or our world?
You know, it's interesting. You take a look at the three different moral standards that there's no greater moral good than the rights of the individual, standard number one. Standard number two, there's no greater moral good than protecting the integrity of the tribe. And then number three, that there's no greater moral good than obeying the teachings of the gods, or the commands of the gods. All three of those moral standards are driven by moral passions. One of the passions is care as opposed to harm. And all three of those moral standards operate from a perspective of care as opposed to harm. All three of those moral standards operate from a perspective of liberty as opposed to oppression. And all three of those moral standards operate from a moral passion of fairness as opposed to unfairness. So there are moral passions that go along with the moral standards, and fairness is one moral passion that is common to every human on the planet, regardless of your moral standard. We all know when something is inherently not fair. And I believe it's not fair if we've not created equity. So I believe in the United States, we've got to deal with our deep, deep systemic racism if we are going to create a fair nation. I believe we need to deal with our religious prejudice if we're going to create a fair United States. And I think the same thing is true across the United States. It is treating every person, every people group, every religion with dignity, that they in fact have the same opportunities to live their lives as we have to live ours, as long as their lives are not harming other people along the way.
Thank you so much, Paula, for all of that. And I think this entire hour now, it's almost an hour and a half. I know we said it'll be an hour, but we couldn't control ourselves, and the
It's
questions were coming
fine.
in. So thank you so much for everything, Paula. And as I mentioned earlier, thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. Everything that you're saying, wherever you go and speak, I think that's the biggest message for at least me right now, that we have to keep talking about all of this, right? We have to keep it. It's our responsibility. We have to keep doing this. So thank you. Have a great night. I know it's what, 11:30 now in the night?
Yeah, it's almost 11:30. Yeah, it's about bedtime.
All right. You please take care of yourself, Paula, and hopefully we'll get an opportunity to speak again at some point of time.
And thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.